John Nelson Darby. Chapter 1. Introductory. John Nelson Darby, 1800 to 1882, an English priest. This terse Anglican description of J.N. Darby in a clerical book of reference entirely fails to convey to the reader the slightest impression of the man by whom a tremendous change was wrought in Christian circles at home and abroad. The conditions prevailing in English-speaking Christendom during the Georgian era are familiar to every student of the period, and present a gloomy picture, unrelieved save by the gleam of evangelical revival under the Wesleys and Whitefield. But in the year 1800, two of the most remarkable men of the 19th century were born. This century, so rich in preachers, theologians, and divines, is admitted by all who are conversant with the so-called religious world of the period to have been powerfully influenced by the personalities of both Edward Bovary Pusey and John Nelson Darby, both of whom made indelible marks upon the face of Christendom. Both became clergymen of the established church and lived lives of unworldly piety, labouring, although in a wholly different way, to realise a great ideal, the visible unity of the Church of God. It is noteworthy that both ended their labours within a few months of each other. Dr. Pusey will ever be remembered by the views and practices associated with his name. He found the Church of England in a state of nearly unparalleled apathy and supineness. The clergy were, with some honourable exceptions, worldly and careless and, like priest, like people. The Lord's Supper was but rarely celebrated. The church buildings were ill-kept and badly attended, and such religion as survived had become the monopoly of the better evangelicals. A writer of this period speaks of the clergy as careless of dispensing the bread of life to their flocks, preaching at best but a carnal and soul-benumbing morality, and trafficking in the souls of men by receiving money for discharging the pastoral offices in parishes where they did not so much as look on the faces of the people more than once a year. And of a typical clergyman further remarks, "He really had no very lofty aims, no theological enthusiasm. If I were closely questioned, I should be obliged to confess that he felt no serious alarms about the souls of his parishioners, and would have thought it a mere loss of time to talk in a doctrinal and awakening manner to old Father Taft, or even to Chad Cranage the blacksmith. If he had been in the habit of speaking theoretically, he would perhaps have said that the only healthy form religion could take in such minds was that of certain dim but strong emotions, suffusing themselves as a hallowing influence over the family affections and neighbourly duties. He thought the custom of baptism more important than its doctrine, and that the religious benefits the peasant drew from the church where his father worshipped and the sacred piece of turf where he lay buried were but slightly dependent on a clear understanding of the liturgy or the sermon. Clearly the rector was not what is called in these days an earnest man. He was fonder of church history than of divinity, and had much more insight into men's characters than interest in their opinions. He was neither laborious, nor obviously self-denying, nor very copious in almsgiving, and his theology, you perceive, was lax. Amongst the dissenting communities there existed at that time a cold exclusiveness almost amounting to Pharisaism. Their hope lay in political reform. The whole professing church, wise and foolish virgins alike, apparently slumbered and slept. The Reform Bill, however, had a manifest and powerful effect. Churchmen could not fail to see that their house was in danger. Then the Anglo-Catholic school within the borders of the establishment began to realise the necessity of resting their claims against radical encroachment on apostolic succession, saving ordinances and imposing forms, to which dissent had no pretension and in fact repudiated. At the same time, the hearts of believers in the various denominations were stirred up to study the Scriptures, and, as ever, in doing so found light pouring into their minds. Some, alas, like Dr. Pusey, instead of being humbled by scriptural light, obscured it by forms and human imaginings, imported mainly from traditions in the writings of the early fathers, thereby sowing baneful seeds of error, which have since become so abundantly fruitful in the established church and her daughters. Disgusted with the sloth and apathy of normal Christendom, these did not so much search the Scriptures as insist on the need of an interpreter for them. They ignored, though unintentionally, the divine instructor, whose special mission is to reveal and explain the things of Christ to his people. So, practically substituting for the present energy of the Holy Spirit the confusions of the so-called fathers, It is little wonder that they rapidly strayed more and more from the truth to masses, confessionals, crucifixes, purgatory, and, in some instances, to holy water stoups and extreme unction, until, as Charles Kingsley observes, all the appliances of religion to deliver a man out of the hands of a merciful God were speedily requisitioned. Yet their main object of visible unity, based on the principles of Catholic corruption after the apostles had departed, and on medieval development, was, in their own eyes, but very partially realised, and even yet to the outsider, although nearly a century had elapsed since the famous assize sermon of Keble, which marked the outward commencement of the Oxford movement, still appears chimerical. Thousands of earnest and some pious souls were enslaved within the bonds of a legal tyranny more irksome and insufferable than that of Judaism. It was, indeed, a species of a Jewish pagano-Christian amalgamation. Some leaders may have been sincere, but mistaken sincerity like theirs only proves too well the subtlety of the enemy of souls and the folly of leaning to one's own understanding in the things of God. Dr. Pusey and his friends therefore sought to establish a restoration of united Christendom, ignoring the palpable fact of its departure from God and his word and spirit, and its ruin doctrinally, ecclesiastically, and morally. John Nelson Darby, on the other hand, with a heart broken by the sense of the Church's sin and ruin, was the unflinching asserter of the rights of the Lord, and of the unfailing word and spirit of God. For over half a century he diligently taught and illustrated by his practice the truth that there still remains as the duty of every member of Christ strenuously to keep the unity of the Spirit, already established by God, whatever the sad universal disorder prevailing in current Christendom. His conception of the Church, noble and sublime, differs widely from that advocated by many in high ecclesiastical positions, but cannot fail to appeal to the spiritual mind. He says, "The Church, a lowly, heavenly body, has no portion on earth at all, as it was at the beginning, suffering as its head did, unknown and well known, an unearthly witness of heavenly things on earth." How John Nelson Darby endeavoured to carry out these principles, and what manner of man he was, the following pages are written to show. Not indeed to glorify the man, but to reveal the aim and ambition of his life.